I am here in the studio with the co-founder of Buzzsprout, Tom Rossi, and we are here to talk about the dark side of video podcasting. Just kidding. But we are here to break down the side of video that you need to understand if you're considering adding video to your show. We're going to talk about the pros and cons of video versus audio only, ultimately to help you understand the role that video plays when it comes to podcasting so that you can make the best and most informed decision about whether or not it's a fit for you. And if it is, why that's okay. And if it's not, why that's okay too. Welcome to Insider Secrets to a Top 100 podcast. I'm your host, Courtney Elmer. Let's make your business binge-worthy. Tom, when you texted me yesterday about what we could potentially talk about in this episode, I'm like, immediate lean in. Because something you said was that video is a threat to podcasting. Tell us more about this. How do you see video as being a threat to podcasting?
Yeah, and let me be clear. It's not that video is bad. Video is an alternative medium. It's a different way to be able to interact with people, but it's fundamentally different than podcasting. In my estimation, what I would consider podcasting, what is compelling about podcasting is, I put on my headphones and I go for a run or I go for a drive and I'm listening, I'm doing something else. Like statistically, we know based on talking to podcast listeners that they're doing something else typically while they're listening to a podcast and they're consuming it all day long, which is fundamentally different than the way that we interact with video. And let's be honest, when we're talking about video, we're talking about YouTube. We're talking about YouTube, who I feel like recently has tried to exercise this dominant position in podcasting, saying, oh, we're the best podcasting platform out there if you want to consume podcasts. But nobody consumes, or very few people consume podcasts on YouTube. Why? Well, because I got to have a video running, right? And nobody watches a 45-minute conversation on YouTube, but they will listen to a 45-minute audio podcast, right? The barrier to entry is so much lower when it's just audio, and you can compete with the best podcasts out there. But as soon as you start doing video, it's very, very difficult to compete. It doesn't mean that it can't be done. It's not saying that there aren't great videos out there, but that's really much harder than what, audio podcasting is. And it's typically a different audience. So even if people do a video podcast and an audio podcast, a lot of times they're not going to be the same people because somebody that's consuming the video is different than somebody who's consuming the audio. This is most clear, I think, when you look at like engagement. If you look at how much do they engage with the content. Typically, we looked at this for one of our podcasts, Buzzcast. We had 3 cameras. We had a video room set up. We went all in on video. And you could go and look at the engagement on those videos and it would average like about 4 minutes. But if you go and you look at the same content on Apple, we would get 35, 40 minutes of engagement. Well, why? Well, they're different listeners on a different medium. So when I talk about video being a threat to podcasting, it's only, insofar as it's redefining podcasting, and it could really burn podcasters out because I'm hearing a lot of pressure being put on podcasters to, you gotta have video. You gotta have video. And I just think you don't have to have video. That was a lot.
Oh, no, that's so good. Because for me, when I think back to why I started my podcast at a time in my life and a season in my business where I could not be on camera all the time. I had an 18-month-old home with me full time, and I was not put together to show up on video. And this is why podcasting was such a beautiful medium for me at the time, and even now still, because it allows me to show up as I am without the pressure of video. And I know for people listening to this podcast right now, some of them are torn. Tom, they're on the fence because you're right. We're getting a lot of pressure from the other side that, you're going to miss out on so much opportunity, so much growth potential because you're not on video. But to your point, they're 2 different animals. So if you're going to go all in on the video, great, do it. But also let's talk about the unique strengths that audio has, because audio does have some unique strengths that video doesn't. And so from your experience, walk us through what are some of those strengths that you see audio having that video simply just can't provide.
It's something that you do while you're doing something else. But there's this strange intimacy that's formed between podcasters and their podcast listeners. And I think I think this is universally true when you talk to podcasters and you talk to podcast listeners, like they have a genuine relationship. They feel like they have this genuine relationship. It's something about the intimacy that's formed of just having that audio in your ear, maybe while you're doing something else, maybe because it's typically longer form content. I don't know what it is, but we know that, again, when you look at research from like Edison Research, when they're polling listeners, like they want more connections with their podcasters. Why is that? It's because there's this intimacy that's formed, and it's different than what you're going to experience in video. Again, I'm not saying that video is bad. I'm saying it could be bad if you go all in on video, and all of a sudden now, like what you were saying, you can't just casually record it. You know, you've got to have the makeup done, and you've got to have good lighting, and you've got to have everything perfect. And we know how much harder it is to edit video. That's the threat to podcasting. To make 45 minutes, for example, of engaging video content is exponentially more difficult than 45 minutes of engaging audio. You can compete with NPR, but it's very difficult to compete with Netflix. It's very difficult to compete with Hulu, right? Which is what you're up against when you're trying to create that kind of video content, right? If they're going to be watching it on their TV, or they're watching it on a device where they would normally consume video content. And let me say this too. There is a difference between this, quote, video podcast versus using video. Like you can still use video. Video and YouTube is not a bad platform. It's just if it becomes the platform for your podcast. So I'll give you a perfect example. We had a podcast that went viral during the pandemic, audio podcast, and they were doing pretty well. And when TikTok was starting to kind of blow up, what they did was they created these like 30-second compelling 30-second videos. And it wasn't a clip, which is what a lot of people do, right? They just take 30 seconds from their podcast and, they put a little audiogram behind it and they put it up and say, oh, look at me, I'm doing video. Kind of, it's just not very engaging video. So what he did was he created engaging video with pictures and a different narrative. And what he said is, oh, if you want the rest of the story, go download the podcast. And he blew up. So we saw his statistics. He was blowing up. We reached out to him. We're like, what did you do in your podcast? Because clearly you did something. And that's what he told us. And I think that's a great example of using the medium, but respecting the medium. He didn't approach video as, oh, this is my podcasting medium. He said, no, this is a medium that people are using to consume short bits of content. It needs to be engaging visually. But I'm going to use that because I know I have listeners that are there. And I know that there's an algorithm that I can take advantage of that people might discover my podcast that don't already know about it. I'm going to use that medium, but I'm going to drive them to my podcast versus trying to put my podcast on TikTok or try to put my podcast on YouTube. I'm going to exploit the medium by using the medium the way it's designed to be used, shorter form content and making it engaging visually. But it's not the same thing like we were talking about of producing a podcast where, man, I just go in my closet, close the door and record. It's hard to make that visually engaging.
It is. Oh my gosh, Tom, I started my podcast literally in my master bedroom closet. I'm like, I don't even know that a green screen would fit in here and that if it could, that it would do any good, right? Like nobody wants to see all these clothes hanging in the background and the giant mess that is my closet. But that's the reality for many of us. And what you said there about respecting the platform and respecting the medium is so key. We've had many conversations here on the show about why just straight up repurposing, clips from your podcast over to social media, for example, doesn't work, but how it can work when you think about the platform that you're ultimately creating that content for. And this is something that I have spoken to YouTube experts about. And they're honest. They're like, look, if anyone tells you that you should be on YouTube just because it's so great and so amazing, they're trying to sell you something. YouTube is work. And if you make the choice to be on YouTube, then great, but you're going to have to go all in. You're going to have to learn YouTube as its own platform and its own strategy. And then look at how does that relate to your podcast versus how can I just put my podcast on YouTube and quote unquote repurpose or better leverage the content that I'm using. And Tom, something else that I think is interesting, I've given this some thought. I'd be curious to hear your take on this. Something that I think is unique about the audio experience is that everything else is stripped away. There's no flashy captions. There's no visuals. There's no, these edits that just like suddenly it's like B-roll flashing in and then this thing and then you see a clip of this and it's all these like little jump cuts and things that might keep us engaged, but that don't necessarily cause us to feel connected, to your point. Do you see that as a unique strength of the audio medium, something about stripping all the noise away that allows us really to cut through the noise in that sense.
Yeah. I know that there's a special bond that's formed between somebody who's listening to a podcast and the podcaster. The listener and the podcaster have a connection that is more intimate than what you see in other types of connections. There's just this feeling. And maybe it's similar to like reading a book, the connection that you might have with an author or the author's ability to connect with you in a way that's different than, again, if it was a movie or a video. But yeah, I think that's true.
So what would your advice then be to podcasters who have maybe been on the fence about video and they're kind of hesitant? They're like, I just don't know that I want to add that in. What advice would you give them as far as the importance of staying focused on what works and how to not give in to the pressures that we might be feeling just because the industry seems to be moving in one direction? This whole everybody else is doing it.
Focus on what got you into podcasting. When you got into podcasting, there was something that you were fired up about that you wanted to talk about and you wanted to get behind a microphone and record. Maybe it's interviews, maybe it's stuff that you want to talk about, but focus on what, you got you into podcasting, because otherwise, again, it's a threat to you, because if you start doing something that's not fun, if it's not life-giving, it's going to be life-sucking. And then next thing you know, you're just going to want to give the whole thing up. And then your voice is gone and you're much better off participating and being there. And let me say one other thing, because you brought it up. I think it's a really good analogy when you talked about social media. There was a lot of talk when social media, was starting to really impact the scene. It's like, oh, well, do I need to be on social media? Do you need to be on social media? No. Are your listeners on social media? Probably. Is it worthwhile to go out and learn a strategy to meet them? Yeah, but not if it sucks the life out of you. It might help you grow your podcast by being out there on social media and meeting your listeners or potential listeners and getting the word out. Do you have to do it? No, you don't have to do it. But could it benefit your show? Absolutely. I feel like it's the same with video. If you go out and you create, like I said, the TikTok videos, or if you go and you create YouTube videos, it's creating something different than your podcast. But you could be doing it because you're respecting the medium and you're trying to find, your audience, your people, on those different platforms. But it is work and you don't have to do it. And I know I was talking to someone about LinkedIn the other day. Like LinkedIn, like we almost forget that it's there because, it's not what people talk about when they talk about social media. But LinkedIn is actually really powerful for those business to business podcasts. And for them, YouTube doesn't make as much sense, but LinkedIn makes sense. So it's the same question. Should I be on LinkedIn? Well, do you want to meet people? Do you want to meet listeners that might be potential, followers of your show and stuff like that? Then it makes sense to be out there. But if it's going to suck the life out of you, don't do it, because it's way more important to keep podcasting than to just do something because other people are doing it.
And this conversation, honestly, what comes up for me is you take your power back versus someone else dictating, okay, here's what you think you need to be doing because these people are doing it, or because these top podcasters are doing it, or because, oh my gosh, you're going to miss the boat if you don't do it. And with your finger on the pulse in the podcasting industry, how do you see video finding its way and making a place as we go forward here over the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years? How do you see this evolving? And what do you think that's going to look like?
I think video will continue to drive people to podcasts. It does serve a purpose of discoverability. Now, you are a slave to the algorithms. If you're on TikTok, if you're on YouTube, if you're on Spotify, like you are a slave to their algorithms, but you can play their game and have it as a channel to get listeners to your show, but not the channel. That's the wonderful thing about podcasting is nobody owns it. If you don't want to play the algorithm games, you don't have to, right? People can still find out about your show. You can still do stuff on the web. You can do stuff in ways that it can't be shut down. Podcasting is open. It's for everyone. And it's one of the things that Buzzsprout, it's fundamental to what we believe about podcasting is it should be open. It should be something that barrier to entry should be really low. You should be able to talk about whatever you want to talk about and be able to reach an audience. And that's what we love about podcasting. And I think that's what a lot of people got into podcasting for.
And I think that's what a lot of people don't necessarily realize about podcasting, because all these other platforms are owned, that it's like not the first thing that would cross your mind, but it is still an open platform. It's still kind of the wild, wild west, even though it's been around for a while, in terms of you being able to use your voice to express yourself authentically without anyone policing you, without, like you said, being a slave to the algorithm. And okay, how do I formulate my content so that this gets enough clicks and views and likes and all the things, where it's like you can just show up as your authentic self and share your expertise with the world and make a meaningful difference with your voice.
Yeah, that authenticity is challenging when you have to play the game of algorithms. Well, I can't talk about certain things because YouTube's going to demonetize me, or whatever. I have to say certain words. I have to do certain things. Well, there goes the attractiveness of podcasting, right? This authentic relationship between a listener and a podcaster, because you're playing the algorithm game. I love the Wild West of podcasting, that there's not one company. If you look at monetizing video content, you're really looking at YouTube. And YouTube, you can say it's a benevolent dictator. I don't know how benevolent they are, but they're definitely a dictator in terms of you're going to make money one way and they're going to control how that plays out. Podcasting doesn't have that right now. That's a great thing, that you can do whatever you can imagine, a way for podcasting to connect to your business, to your way of creating value. You can do that. There's no one that's going to tell you no.
Well, Tom, I think you are giving so many people hope right now. And honestly, just a refreshing take on this conversation, where we keep being bombarded with video podcast is the next big thing. It's the next big thing. You're going to miss the boat. And really, for those of us that are here to master our craft as podcasters first, that now there's a path forward to be able to do that, and where we can just kind of silence those other voices, those outside voices that say, you need to do this, you need to do this, you have to do this, you should be doing that. And in the next episode, I'm excited to get into that with you. How can we actually look at maximizing the value of our podcast? How should we be looking at measuring our success? How can we actually just enjoy what we're doing with podcasting without these outside pressures? And what metrics should we be looking at to really measure our progress? So Tom, thank you for all that you've shared here, and for being so honest and candid about what you really see the role video playing in podcasting and in the future of podcasting.
Thanks, Courtney.
So there you have it, the honest truth. That video podcasting, first and foremost, is not going anywhere, but ultimately that it's going to be up to you to decide if it's a fit for you. And if it's not, that your podcast is not doomed. And if it is, then you'll be better equipped to go all in on the video aspect of your podcast. Because I only have one goal here on the show, and that's to present you with the information that you need to make the most informed decision for your podcast that you can. Because if there's one thing that will never change, it's that you're the host, which means you get to call the shots. And if you found this episode helpful, I would love it if you would scroll down and take 30 seconds to write a review, or at the very least, tap the 5 stars on Apple or on Spotify. And then don't go anywhere, because in the next episode, Tom is going to join us back with a refreshing way to look at measuring the success of your show and why the almighty download is on its way out. That's all coming up next to help you make your business binge-worthy.